November 18, 1978, the Kennedy Center Opera House, Washington, D.C. Marvin Gaye stepped onto the stage expecting another routine performance, another night of delivering the smooth romantic persona that Motown had crafted for him. The audience of 2,200 people erupted in applause, anticipating the voice that had given them "What's Going On" and countless love songs. But 30 seconds into his opening number, Marvin's voice cracked, not from emotion or technical difficulty, from terror. Because in the third row, center section, sitting with his arms crossed and his jaw set in that familiar expression of disapproval, was Marvin Gaye Sr. The man who had beaten him, belittled him, and broken something inside him that no amount of success could repair. The microphone trembled in Marvin's hand. He had not expected this, had not prepared for this. In all the years of performing, through all the concerts and recordings and interviews, he had managed to keep that world separate from this one. But now the two were colliding, and Marvin felt like the scared child he had never stopped being, standing in his father's shadow, waiting for the next blow to fall. What happened next lasted only 4 minutes and 37 seconds, but it changed Marvin Gaye forever. Because that night, in front of an audience full of strangers, the mask he had worn his entire adult life finally slipped, and everyone saw what was underneath. To understand why the sight of his father destroyed Marvin so completely that night, you need to understand what had happened between them behind closed doors. Marvin Gaye Sr. wasn't just a difficult parent or a strict disciplinarian. He was a man whose own brokenness manifested as cruelty toward the son who reminded him of everything he hated about himself. The elder Marvin was a Pentecostal preacher who spoke of God's love on Sundays while practicing violence at home. He was a cross-dresser in an era when such behavior was not only taboo but dangerous, a man caught between his public image and his private identity, taking out that internal conflict on his family. Young Marvin bore the brunt of this rage, enduring beatings that left bruises, psychological manipulation that left scars, and a constant message that he was worthless, sinful, and damned. But the physical abuse was only part of the damage. The deeper wound came from the contradiction, the impossibility of reconciling a father who preached about divine love while practicing earthly cruelty. How do you trust love when the person who is supposed to embody it hurts you? How do you believe in your own worth when the first man in your life tells you repeatedly that you have none? Marvin carried these questions with him as he grew up, as he found his voice, as he became successful. The music was his escape, his way of creating a world where love was pure and pain had meaning. But underneath every smooth vocal run, every romantic lyric, every carefully crafted public appearance, was the frightened child who never knew when the next blow would come. By 1978, Marvin had not spoken to his father in over 2 years. The decision to cut contact had been difficult but necessary, one of the few acts of self-preservation he had managed in a life full of self-destructive choices. He had told his mother, his siblings, even his management team that he didn't want to know where his father was or what he was doing. As far as Marvin was concerned, that chapter of his life was closed. But Marvin Gaye Sr. had other plans. The concert was part of Marvin's Love Man Tour, a series of intimate performances designed to reconnect him with audiences after the commercial disappointment of his more experimental recent work. The Kennedy Center show was sold out, filled with fans who wanted to hear the hits, wanted to be seduced by the smooth romantic persona that had made Marvin famous. These people didn't come to see vulnerability or pain. They came to be entertained, to forget their own problems for a few hours while Marvin's voice transported them to a place where love conquered all. Marvin knew this. He had performed this role thousands of times, slipping into the character of the romantic prince with the ease of a professional actor. But maintaining that character required a certain emotional distance, a wall between his public self and his private pain. The wall that his father's presence had just demolished. When Marvin walked onto the Kennedy Center stage that night, he felt good. The audience response was warm, the sound system was excellent, and he was in strong voice. He opened with "Gotta Give It Up," a crowd favorite that usually got everyone moving. The first verse went smoothly. The audience was with him, clapping along, singing the familiar words. Everything was normal until Marvin's eyes swept across the third row during the instrumental break. There he was, Marvin Gaye Sr., wearing a dark suit and that expression Marvin remembered from childhood. The look that said disappointment, disapproval, judgment. Their eyes met for just a moment, but that moment was enough. 38 years of fear, anger, and unresolved trauma came flooding back, and Marvin's voice simply stopped working. The band continued playing, but Marvin had gone silent. He stood at the microphone, his mouth moving but no sound coming out. His eyes locked on his father's face. The audience began to notice something was wrong. The clapping became uncertain, then scattered, then stopped altogether. Musicians on stage kept playing, waiting for Marvin to come back in, but he seemed frozen, trapped in some internal struggle that no one else could see. What Marvin was experiencing in that moment was not just stage fright or performance anxiety. It was a complete psychological regression, his adult mind collapsing into the terrified child who had learned to associate his father's presence with pain. The confident performer who had just walked on stage was gone, replaced by someone much younger, much more vulnerable, someone who had never learned how to stand up for himself. The silence stretched on. 15 seconds. 20. The band members began exchanging worried looks. In the audience, people started whispering, wondering if this was part of the show, if Marvin was having some kind of technical problem, if something was seriously wrong. But Marvin Gaye Sr. just sat there, unmoved, watching his son fall apart with the same cold expression he had worn during all those childhood beatings. Finally, somehow, Marvin found his voice again. But when he started singing, it was different. The smooth, controlled tone was gone, replaced by something raw and uncertain. His pitch wavered. His timing was off. He forgot lyrics to songs he had performed hundreds of times. The confident, romantic persona had been stripped away, and what remained was just a broken man trying to remember how to breathe. He struggled through the rest of Got to Give It Up, but it was painful to watch. Members of the audience shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some began to leave, disappointed that the polished show they had paid to see was turning into something uncomfortable and private. Others stayed out of morbid curiosity, sensing they were witnessing something significant, even if they didn't understand what. Between songs, Marvin tried to collect himself. He walked to the side of the stage, took a drink of water, wiped his face with a towel. But every time he looked back out at the audience, his eyes went immediately to the third row, to his father's impassive face. And each time the fear returned, the sense of being small and powerless and wrong. The second song was Sexual Healing, a newer track that required a different kind of vocal performance, something more intimate and controlled. But Marvin couldn't find that control. His voice cracked on the high notes. He missed cues. At one point, he stopped singing entirely in the middle of a verse, just stood there holding the microphone, staring at his father. The musicians kept playing, but the disconnect between the sensual music and Marvin's obvious distress created an atmosphere of profound discomfort. Some people in the audience began to understand that this wasn't a technical problem or a momentary lapse. Something was fundamentally wrong, and it had to do with whatever or whoever Marvin was staring at in the third row. A few fans turned to look in that direction, trying to figure out what had captured their performer's attention so completely. What they saw was an older black man in a dark suit, sitting perfectly still while the chaos unfolded around him. He wasn't clapping. He wasn't singing along. He wasn't even watching the stage. He was watching Marvin, but with an expression that seemed to contain no warmth, no pride, no recognition of the fact that his presence was destroying his son's ability to perform. Marvin tried to push through. He attempted 3 more songs, but each one was worse than the last. His voice kept failing him. He forgot lyrics. He missed entrances. At one point, he started singing the wrong song entirely, beginning What's Going On when the band was playing Let's Get It On. The musicians tried to follow his lead, but the result was musical chaos. The breaking point came during I Heard It Through the Grapevine. Marvin had just reached the song's emotional climax when his voice cracked completely. Not a small mistake or a momentary lapse, but a complete vocal breakdown. He doubled over at the microphone, clutching his stomach as if he had been punched. When he straightened up, there were tears in his eyes. The audience fell completely silent. Even the musicians stopped playing. For a moment, the only sound in the Kennedy Center was Marvin's labored breathing through the microphone. He looked out at the crowd, then back at his father, then out at the crowd again. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. "I'm sorry," and he said, "I can't do this tonight." And then he walked off stage. The audience sat in stunned silence for several minutes, not sure whether this was part of the show, whether Marvin would return, whether they should applaud or leave or demand their money back. Eventually, a stagehand came out and announced that the concert was over due to the performer's illness, and that ticket holders could receive refunds at the box office. But Marvin wasn't ill in any conventional sense. He was experiencing something much more complex and devastating: the complete collapse of the psychological barriers he had built to protect himself from his childhood trauma. The presence of his father had stripped away every defense mechanism, every coping strategy, every professional instinct, leaving him exposed and helpless in front of thousands of strangers. Backstage, Marvin locked himself in his dressing room and refused to see anyone. His manager knocked on the door, trying to understand what had happened, trying to figure out how to handle the public relations disaster that was already unfolding. Music journalists who had been in the audience were calling their editors, filing stories about Marvin Gaye's mysterious breakdown. Fans were gathering outside the venue, confused and concerned. But Marvin couldn't deal with any of that. He sat in his dressing room chair, still in his performance clothes, staring at himself in the mirror. The face looking back at him wasn't the confident performer or the romantic prince. It was the scared child his father had created, the one who had never learned to believe in his own worth, the one who had spent his entire adult life trying to prove he deserved to exist. Hours passed. The venue emptied out. The journalists went home to write their stories. The fans eventually dispersed. But Marvin stayed in that dressing room until dawn, trying to figure out how he was going to survive this. Because he knew that what had happened wasn't just a bad night or a temporary setback. Something fundamental had been broken, and he wasn't sure it could be fixed. The reviews were brutal. The Washington Post called it a disturbing spectacle of an artist in crisis. Rolling Stone wondered whether Marvin Gaye's career could survive such a public meltdown. Other concerts on the tour were immediately canceled. Ticket sales for future shows plummeted. Within a week, it became clear that Marvin's performing career might be over. But the professional damage was nothing compared to the personal devastation. The night at the Kennedy Center had forced Marvin to confront the fact that he had never really escaped his father's influence. All the success, all the accolades, all the years of distance meant nothing when faced with the source of his original trauma. He was still that frightened child, still powerless, still broken. The incident created a pattern that would define the rest of Marvin's life. Every subsequent performance was haunted by the possibility that his father might show up again. Every time Marvin walked on stage, part of his attention was focused on scanning the audience for that familiar face. The fear never left him completely, creating a level of performance anxiety that made live concerts increasingly difficult to endure. More tragically, the Kennedy Center breakdown convinced Marvin that he could never really be free from his past. If his father's mere presence could destroy him so completely, what hope did he have of ever healing? The incident reinforced his belief that he was fundamentally damaged, that the violence and psychological abuse had left wounds that would never fully heal. This sense of permanent brokenness contributed to the depression and self-destructive behavior that characterized Marvin's final years. He increased his drug use, isolated himself from friends and family, and became increasingly paranoid and unstable. The man who had created some of the most beautiful music of the 20th century began to believe that he was irredeemably damaged, beyond the reach of love or healing. The cruel irony was that Marvin Gaye Sr. had achieved something that all his years of physical and psychological abuse had never quite accomplished. By simply showing up to a concert, by sitting silently in the third row, he had proven to his son that the past was inescapable, that no amount of success or distance could provide real freedom from childhood trauma. The Kennedy Center incident became a defining moment in Marvin's life, not because of what happened, but because of what it revealed. All the years of therapy, all the attempts to create a new identity through music, all the relationships and achievements and creative triumphs had been built on a foundation of unresolved pain. And when that foundation was tested by his father's presence, everything collapsed. In the years that followed, Marvin rarely spoke publicly about what happened that night. When pressed by interviewers, he would say he had been feeling unwell, that it was a temporary health problem, that these things happen in live performance. But privately, to close friends, he would describe it as the night he realized he would never be free, the night he understood that some damage can't be undone. The last conversation between Marvin and his father took place 6 years after the Kennedy Center incident, on April 1st, 1984, when Marvin Gaye Sr. shot his son to death in their family home in Los Angeles. In some tragic way, it was the final act of a drama that had begun with a frightened child and an abusive father, played out over decades but never truly resolved. Today, when music historians discuss Marvin Gaye's career, they often focus on his artistic achievements, his influence on soul music, his role in the civil rights movement. But for those who understand the full scope of his story, the Kennedy Center breakdown represents something equally important, a moment when the mask slipped, when the public saw the private pain that had always existed beneath a smooth, romantic persona. It was a reminder that artists are human, that success doesn't erase childhood trauma, that sometimes the very talents that make someone special also make them vulnerable in ways the public never sees. And it was a preview of the tragedy that would eventually claim Marvin's life, the final proof that some wounds never heal, that some fathers never stop being dangerous, and that some children never stop being afraid. The boy who stood on that stage in 1978, frozen by fear and broken by the sight of his father's face, was the same boy who would die 6 years later, still trapped by forces he had never learned to overcome. The Kennedy Center was just the moment when that truth became impossible to hide.